Some think that as long as people understand you, accuracy doesn't matter much, but others think that errors should be avoided at all costs. How serious are errors when trying to communicate in Chinese? Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about accuracy, communication, and comprehensibility, and more specifically, how errors influence your ability to communicate in Chinese. So, for example, if the other person understands what you want to order in a restaurant, does it matter if your tones are wrong? Or if your landlord can read the note you wrote on her door, does it matter if some of the characters were incorrectly written? Or is it okay if your emails to your colleagues contain strange word order, provided that they otherwise understand what you mean? Before we start talking about these things, I think it's interesting to put this in an historical context. Nowadays, most modern language course curricula use a communicative approach, and so the goal is communication, and your ability is evaluated based on what you can do with a language. This is still rather new, and it didn't used to be like this, and there are still many countries and education systems where it isn't like this today either. If we go back a long time, institutional language learning was mostly about reading and translation. The point was to be able to read something in, say, Latin and translate it to your native language. Of course, this is also a form of communication, but it's very limited, and we're not talking about communicating in the target language. Even though this is not very useful for, say, surviving in a foreign country or actually doing something in the target language, this is still an approach that can be easily seen in most university courses and other institutional learning situations. For example, if we look at university courses in Chinese here in Sweden, it's rather easy to see that there's a heavy focus on the written language, there's lots of translation usually, and reading certainly has a higher status than, say, listening. Now, this doesn't mean that people don't learn to speak, but if you look at the curriculum itself and the way people are tested, it's certainly a very strong focus on the written language and also on translation. It's rather interesting to compare what's going on in the tertiary education system, i.e. universities, where things are rather traditional, with what's going on in the secondary education system, i.e. high schools, where things are much more modern and much more focused on actual practical ability and communication. I don't think Sweden is unique in this regard, and I've heard from students from all over the world that indeed university courses still tend to focus a lot on the written language and also sometimes translation. If we move forward a little bit in history to the era of behaviorism, language was thought to be like any other habit that you try to form, and when you try to do something like that, errors are really bad and should be avoided at all costs. Since then, the pendulum has swung in the other direction, and the question I want to talk about today, among other things, is if it's maybe swung a little bit too far in some cases. When I say that, I don't mean your average university course, it probably obsesses too much about accuracy, but I mean people who think that communication and accuracy are two different things, and maybe even two opposed things. And this is a false dichotomy. Of course, communication is influenced by accuracy, but this relationship is not always very straightforward. Pronunciation is an area where I think accuracy matters quite a lot, not because it's always important to say things the right way, but because if you say something incorrectly all the time, that pattern will settle in your brain and it will be kind of hard to fix later. And believe me, as those of you who have followed Hacking Chinese or this podcast for a long time, you will know that I learned the third tone incorrectly when I started learning Chinese, and it took an awful lot of effort to fix that. If you are new to the podcast, you can check out episode 26, where I talked about this in more detail. Beyond that, there are many other reasons to think that accuracy is actually rather important sometimes, and it does have an impact on communication, but I will get back to that in a bit. First, let's look at some cases where errors don't influence communication at all. A good example of this would be spelling errors in English, and you have probably seen those examples where they scramble the letters in the middle of words, and you can still basically read what it says. Sometimes, if you read quickly, you might not even notice that there's something peculiar about the words. If you haven't seen such a text in English, I've provided a link in the description. The same thing is of course true in Chinese. Native speakers, when they read, don't look at every individual stroke. So if you make minor mistakes, most native speakers probably won't notice it if your handwriting is otherwise okay. There's an article called The Persistence of Comprehension, link in the description, that gives a good example of this in Chinese. It shows a simple handwritten message in Chinese where someone has arbitrarily added strokes and otherwise modified the characters. In this case, these are not errors, they were introduced deliberately for fun, but we could imagine that they were indeed errors from a student. And to see some of these, you actually have to study the characters rather carefully, and if you read quickly, some of the characters look okay, even if they have extra strokes, dots, or swapped components. Naturally, it depends on how the characters were modified, and some of them are rather hard to read. This is a good example of the power of top-down processing, because reading and listening comprehension is largely built on our prior knowledge, our expectations of what we see, and so on, so we're able to fill in and extrapolate where things don't make sense, and we don't necessarily need to see all the details to guess the whole. And you have probably experienced this when reading in Chinese, and you think that it's a certain word because normally after this character, this other character appears, and sometimes you just say that word even if it's something else written on the page. That's what's going on here, except now the characters are very similar to the correct characters, so you're even less likely to notice. If you look at the cover image of this podcast episode, you can see a message that was created specifically for this purpose and to show a slightly more realistic example of the kind of errors that learners might actually make. If you want to see the full picture, including with corrections, head over to the article on Hacking Chinese. So it's safe to say that some errors have little or no impact on your ability to communicate, but that shouldn't be taken as a blank check to ignore accuracy completely, because there are many cases where errors actually do matter quite a lot. If you dig deeper into the examples I've mentioned so far, you'll also see that it's not always the case that you can just change anything in a character or scramble the letters in a word in English any way you want, and it will still come out as legible. These effects are also largely due to visual chunking, which is rather different from what happens when we're speaking Chinese and we have to chunk spoken audio. There are comparable things going on with spoken language as well, especially if you speak very quickly and we're talking about unstressed syllables, but this doesn't matter much for beginners because most errors will be very clear and evident. It's also important to note that top-down processing is of course very context-dependent. It requires us to understand the context to be able to predict what someone is going to say. Something we did talk about in episode 45, where I said that the importance of tones is inversely proportional to the predictability of what you say. Or in other words, if there is lots of context enabling the listener to use top-down processing, you can make lots of mistakes and still be understood, whereas if the listener has less context to rely on, you need to be more accurate when you speak in order to communicate successfully. Or to put it very simply, if the listener can guess what you're going to say even before you've said it, you can make as many errors as you want. Of course, the number of errors is actually quite important. If you have one small mistake in an utterance, it's unlikely that that mistake will make the listener unable to understand what you want to say, but if there are dozens of errors, it will obviously be harder. These errors don't need to be confined to a specific area though, such as pronunciation. It could very well be that you have some errors in pronunciation, maybe a tone, maybe a final, maybe an initial, and then your grammar is slightly off, you use the wrong word order, and maybe you also choose the wrong words in certain situations. Now your Chinese is actually quite difficult to understand, even if each error on its own is actually rather small. Errors do compound, and we might say that a typo is not very important, but that doesn't mean you can ignore spelling, for example. Or a slip of the tongue might not make your utterance incomprehensible, but that doesn't mean you can ignore pronunciation. It also matters what type of errors you're making. For example, native speakers have somewhat flexible models for how the language works, so even if they listen to someone who pronounces a word somewhat differently from they do, that's usually not a problem, at least not if they've had exposure to this type of pronunciation before. So for example, if they listen to someone who is from Shanghai and they are from Beijing, that is usually not a problem because they're used to this kind of accent in Mandarin and they hear it all the time. The problem is, of course, that most Chinese people are not used to listening to foreigners. I mean, your teacher is used to that, but normal people are not. This means that there are three ways of relating to the standard language. And the first is to follow the standard completely. And that is, of course, the goal. And that will mean that you make no errors and that everything is fine. We don't need to discuss this too much, but I have written an article called Standard Pronunciation in Chinese and Why You Want It. And I'll put a link in the description. The second way you can deviate from the standard is to do so in a well-known way, in a familiar way to most people. And this would be the example of someone from Shanghai speaking Mandarin, which is something that most Chinese people have heard and that is not a problem. This can sometimes include errors that to us as foreigners look very egregious, such as mixing up F and H, so you say 回机 instead of 飞机, for example. This was covered in episode 46 of the podcast, where I talked about learning to understand regionally accented Mandarin. The third way you can deviate from the standard language is in your own idiosyncratic way. And like I just said, simply having a foreign accent is somewhat idiosyncratic and will make you harder to understand. If you have a very peculiar foreign accent, this also matters. For example, more Chinese people will be familiar with how Japanese, Korean, or Americans speak Chinese compared with, say, people from Finland or Egypt. The exception here is, of course, professional teachers who are very good at understanding what students say. And it's indeed not unusual to hear students complain about the fact that they can communicate perfectly well with their teacher, but when they talk to people on the street, they don't understand anything and people don't understand what they say, because they are of course not used to this foreign accent. Anyway, it should be clear that some, but not perfect accuracy is needed to communicate successfully. I said before that communication and accuracy are of course not opposed to each other, but it's usually the case that it's good to focus on one at a time because it is very hard to focus on both communication and accuracy at the same time. A good way of doing this is to focus on communication first, so you try to achieve something, you try to do something in the language, and then afterwards you go back and see, okay, what could I have improved in terms of accuracy? Were there any errors that I should try to fix? And so on. Trying to balance these two is not very easy. On the one hand, we have teachers and students who mostly care about accuracy. And I think this is rather bad. It leads to a lot of anxiety and very slow progress. As I've argued many times on the podcast and on Hacking Chinese, quantity beats quality, and it's not always necessary to be accurate to be able to communicate. So for example, it's usually a better idea to know 20 words and not be able to use them very well than it is to know one word but know how to use it perfectly accurately. Try for example to explain to someone in a supermarket that you want flour without knowing the word for flour. This is rather hard, but if you just know the word, you will be able to communicate. Little or no accuracy is needed. Also, if you obsess over accuracy, you miss out opportunities to learn about communicative strategies that you really need to be able to talk Chinese in real-world situations. You need to be able to deal with problems when people don't understand what you say, or when you don't understand what they say, and so on. So there certainly is such a thing as caring too much about accuracy, and I think indeed that most university courses especially fall into this trap. Then there also is such a thing as caring too little about accuracy, but like I said, this rarely happens in institutional contexts. The problem with not caring about accuracy at all is that people in such situations will learn to use Chinese to the level that is required of them in that specific context, so they can communicate with people around them. However, when they move to other contexts or want to use their Chinese for something else, they might find that their accuracy is not enough to express what they want and they will have a hard time communicating. And I've talked with many students who find themselves in this position. They've been able to talk with people around them, maybe family, maybe partners and so on, but now they're trying to use it for work and they figure out that suddenly their tones are too bad and people don't understand anything of what they're saying and so on. It might also be the case that people you hang out with a lot are very tolerant to the way you speak, but if you start talking to more strangers, they will not be as attuned to your way of speaking, and then communication will break down. It's hard for me to know what situation you're in, but I think it makes sense to try to think about your own situation. And you can think of this as a spectrum, from courses where every single error is pointed out and accuracy is everything that matters, to a situation where nobody cares about accuracy at all. If you find yourself in the first situation, you should maybe try to focus more on communication, i.e. getting things done in Chinese, achieving communicative goals relying only on Chinese. And it doesn't matter about accuracy here, as long as the other person understands what you're trying to say. On the other hand, if you find yourself in the other end of the spectrum and no one has ever corrected anything you say and you don't really know how accurate your Chinese is, maybe it's a good idea to figure this out, especially if you want to level up your Chinese and be able to use it in a multitude of contexts. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.